Today's Take 5 with the Saints, January the 28th, is a figure who you might be thinking as an Anglican or Episcopalian, why do we celebrate him? Thomas Aquinas. But I hope, just from my little snippet here, you will understand that Thomas Aquinas is not just a thinker for Roman Catholics. He indeed, along with St. Augustine, are arguably the two greatest theological thinkers of Western Christianity ever. And so from that, we definitely recognize and celebrate his influence on the life of the church and of our particular nook of it here in the Anglican Communion here today. The scripture for today's feast day, the one I would like to use, is out of the book of Wisdom, chapter 7, verses 7 through 14. Therefore I prayed, and understanding was given me. I called on God, and the spirit of wisdom came to me. I preferred her to scepters and thrones, and I accounted wealth as nothing in comparison with her. Neither did I liken to her any priceless gem, because all gold is but a little sand in her sight, and silver will be accounted as clay before her. I loved her more than health and beauty, and I chose to have her rather than light, because her radiance never ceases. All good things came to me along with her, and in her hands uncounted wealth. I rejoiced in them all, because wisdom leads them, but I did not know that she was their mother. I learned without guile, and I impart without grudging. I do not hide her wealth, for it is an unfailing treasure for mortals. Those who get it obtain friendship with God, commended for the gifts that come from instruction. So Thomas was born into a noble Italian family sometime around the year 1225, and from a very early age, Thomas's intellectual and spiritual abilities were recognized, and at an early age, he entered the Dominican order of preachers, and in an age in which a lot of established intellectual norms were being challenged, he became one of the great thinkers. Now, if you know anything about Thomas Aquinas, it is probably you have at least seen, if not read, some of his, perhaps arguably his greatest work, the Summa Theologica, another one of his important works called Summa contra Gentiles, or the argument against the Gentiles, which I don't want to focus on his specific works, but needless to say, particularly in the Summa Theologica, he makes a series of arguments that seek to start from a premise and then from that deducts different conclusions from those premises. His reason for doing this, and I say this very important for you to hear this, is that oftentimes people look at Aquinas as being outdated because of his method today, when in fact Aquinas, for writing in the 13th century, was actually considered somewhat of a radical, and in fact it was somewhat debated as to the worth of his contributions until he was finally canonized after his death. But during that time, there began to creep in some thinking or reintroduction of ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotelian thought, which essentially, going into a long philosophical dissertation here, said that human beings could reason and understand the world and not really needing faith and revelation to be a part of that. It was this movement that laid the groundwork for what became known as the Renaissance movement that began really in the next century and in earnest in the century after that. But it left the church in a crossroads because for first time in a long time there was active questioning as to the church's authority and leadership and to the content of whether the message of what the church had to say was really valid. Seems like a very relevant discussion, in my opinion, to where we are in the world today. Different questions, but the same problems being posed. And from this, Thomas wanted to clarify that reason and revelation go hand in hand. They are not separate. One of his great analogies, which I always butcher when I share it, but essentially is that God and creation are two very distinct things. And to truly understand God means we can only understand God through revelation, particularly through things like the sacraments. But in looking at the creation through our reason and empirical ways of looking at things, we can deduce from what we see that there is indeed a God. Reason and revelation work well together in helping us to understand that indeed there is something behind what it is that we see. And this became a way in which the church not only was able to answer some of these pressing questions being posed against it in the 13th century, but also continue to thrive and grow. And some people would say that some of Thomas's theology was taken a little too far, and was some of the theology that in fact was challenged during the Protestant Reformation a few centuries later. But without Thomas Aquinas, the Christian church would look very different, and not in a good way. In fact, some would argue it might not even exist if not for the faithful arguments and reasoning of Thomas Aquinas. One last thing to mention about Aquinas that is something to note. He died in the year 1274, just under 50 years of age, and in his own journals that we know, he was regarded himself to be somewhat of a workaholic, someone who offered this great gift to the church. But for people in my ilk in the clergy world, is a reminder to us and to all people that even with these great contributions, Sabbath, rest, and refreshment are very important, as Thomas Aquinas is not really considered this, but jokingly considered the patron saint of burnouts. So, for all of his great contributions to the church, also remember that part of our life of faith is to find those times to rest and be refreshed in the presence of God. Again, this is scratching the surface of a great contributor to our church and to our theology today. If you dare to take up the Summa Theologica, try. I'm always happy to read through it with people who are interested in trying to explore it, because it is worth the effort to put into it. So, with that being said, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Our saint for tomorrow is Andrei Rublev. Join me as we explore his life, and I tell you a little bit about who Andrei Rublev is. Take care and see you then.